Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight on this gorgeous Friday night. I'm just going to keep admitting people as I do my introductions. So firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm currently on, the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the land in which you're all joining us from tonight on Zoom. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Oh, there's lots of you coming in. We've got a big Zoom crowd tonight. I'm just admitting you all. So thank you all for joining us on this Friday. I'm so pleased to be here with you for this special discussion of Larissa Behrendt's new book, After Story, in conversation tonight with Chelsea Watego. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'll just run through some housekeeping briefly. For our audience, you will be muted for the session, but if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. I'm about to send through a link where you can purchase After Story, and that will also show you how to use the chat box function, which will be very important for our Q&A tonight that will take place at around 7:15. So please type in your questions throughout, and then I'll pass them on to Larissa toward the end. And lastly, just in the corner of your screen where it says view, make sure you're set to speaker view. That way you'll be able to see Chelsea and Larissa full screen. And so I would like to now introduce Chelsea, who will be taking things from here. Chelsea is a Mununjani and South Sea Islander woman and associate lecturer within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit at the University of Queensland. With over 20 years experience working within Indigenous health as a health worker and researcher, she is a prolific writer and public intellectual. She is a founding board member of the Inala Wangara, an Indigenous Community Development Association within her community, and was one half of the Wild Black Women radio podcast show. Her forthcoming book, Another Day in the Colony, is to be released this year in November. Over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for joining us tonight. I just want to acknowledge I'm here on Yagara country, and I visited this place, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country in which you're joining us this Friday night. I should say I've since left the University of Queensland now at QUT, so I should update my bio. And I just want to say I'm so excited to be able to talk about this book, but even more excited just to be in conversation with such an amazing writer, academic, human being who I have admired as for some time, not just as a writer, but as someone who's kind of set the parameters or the possibilities for what we could do as Black academics in this place and this time in terms of the breadth of Professor Behrendt's career. But I might, before we get into yarns, just do a bit of an introduction to the distinguished professor, who I know needs no introduction, but I think deserves also the introduction. So, of course, Professor Larissa Behrendt is Professor of Indigenous Research and Director of Research at the Jimbana Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney. She is a regular columnist for The Guardian and has published numerous textbooks on Indigenous legal issues. She's also the author of two novels, Home, which won the 2002 David Uniapin Award and the 2005 Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the Best First Book. And then Legacy, of course, which won the 2010 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing. She was awarded the 2009 NAIDOC Person of the Year Award and 2011 New South Wales Australian of the Year. Thank you, Professor Behrendt, for being with us tonight.
Oh, it's so great. Chelsea, Professor Watego, I should say, and it's lovely for me. I'm on Gadigal land, so I just like to acknowledge country as well from where I am and say it's a bit mutual tonight. I've been a long admirer of your work and advocacy, so I'm really looking forward to tonight. And I know it's a bit overwhelming to see so many people, but I have to do a quick shout out to Anita Heiss and Robin Quiggin in particular, who have been long-time friends on this strange journey that I've been on, and a little shout out to Amy Maguire as well, who I also admire and has been a great support.
Okay. I might, before we get into the book, Larissa, do you want to give us a sense for those, because we're going to try and not do spoilers for those who haven't read the book, but could you tell us about the book more broadly for those who haven't yet got their hands on a copy?
Sure. So I guess it's always a bit hard to know where to start with these things, but I guess at the heart of it, I see After Story as a book about the relationship between a mother and a daughter in a circumstance where there has been a murder in the family a couple of decades before. So it really looks at the impact of that circumstance on their relationship, and I guess is a way of exploring the legacy of intergenerational trauma that we see through a lot of our First Nations families. In addition to that, I guess in terms of exploring those thematics, I take my characters out of Australia and put them on a literary tour of England, which is a way of Jasmine as the university educated daughter trying to connect to Della to show her a little bit more of the world that she's got into. Della never left the country town, and so has a very different worldview to her daughter, but through both of their engagements with this world, they start to be able to explore the issues in their relationship to try and find a way forward. So I guess I did a bit of a reverse of white people coming to Australia to look at Aboriginal people, and took my First Nations characters over to the land of the colonizer to try and see the world from that point of view. But I guess just in relation to that, Chelsea, I know you and I were talking earlier that actually for all of us that have travelled overseas, whatever our background, it's always a chance for us to see ourselves a little bit differently when we take ourselves out of that place. So I guess those were kind of some of the things I was thinking about when I placed my characters in that world.
Yeah, and it's the book is structured in a way where we read Mum Della's account and Jasmine's account of the tour. And so it splits between their voices the whole way through. And there's this kind of interesting story along the way around the way in which Indigenous knowledges and Western knowledges are valued or not valued, and sort of the collisions and similarities between them. And so as a black fella in the academy, a lot of that, I wasn't so much, I'll be honest, I wasn't so much excited about a literary tour in England. It's not what I typically read about. But what for me was the conversations around this in terms of how Della's interpreting this tour, and the way in which her stories are relegated in some of those conversations. And of course, the character whose voice we don't hear, but we hear, is Elaine. Can you tell us about Elaine as the kind of this third but most important character in the book?
Yeah, yeah, I feel like, I mean, she's the heartbeat of the story, and there's a lot of reasons why it felt important for me to have her there. She obviously is a representation and an amalgam of that kind of matriarch that we all know in our communities, who just does whatever they are carrying themselves. They have that generosity of spirit that pulls the whole community together. They are the glue. And I guess there are a couple of things I wanted to do with her, apart from just paying the proper homage to that character within our community and the importance of those women. And in my experience, just in my life, those people have always been women. So I wanted to, you know, show that respect. But I sort of see that, you know, she's the, in a way, there's also a cautionary tale with Elaine. Part of Jasmine's journey, of course, is she's been one of those people who've been able to navigate her way through the Western education system and has gone to university. And she's now at a point in her life where she's sort of starting to realise by being able to succeed in that world, she's left part of her culture behind. And she's, you know, that's part of her journey. And that's kind of why it was fun to play her off Della, who doesn't have any of that that sense of having been pulled away from who she is. So she's able to really give us that, you know, very down to earth kind of cut through, that she sees the world, you know, in a very authentic way, and a very real way. And I love the way in which she, you know, playing with a character like her, for example, when she goes to Bath, she thinks it's going to be like a bath, and of course it's not. So she's sort of surprised and kind of impressed. But then she's the the voice through which we can start to see her say, well, why, yeah, sure, this is great, but what about the fish traps? They're so much older than these. You know, she's just got that kind of sense. So there is that back and forth between those two characters. But I sort of felt that Elaine became a bridge for them, like in terms of how they find themselves coming back to each other. It's their memories of her and the things that Arnie Elaine's wisdom that is a really big part of that. And when I say it's a bit of a cautionary tale, of course, you know, I feel like what she represents is the important custodians of that. If the book is about celebrating those Indigenous knowledges and those stories, she is the holder of that. And if we don't take care to capture them, you know, then we lose them. So Della and Jasmine are in a process of having to use memory to recreate Arnie Elaine. And, you know, for those of us that still have the Arnie Elaines around, I hope we get out the tape recorders and the whatever the new technology is and record those stories of those amazing women.
Mm. You know, the book deals with some really challenging themes, and it would be easy, you know, some of the themes that are raised in the book, the way in which they appear in public discourse in terms of how Indigenous peoples and communities are imagined, are undertaken in really dehumanising ways that pathologise our communities and things like that. What I love about your writing, having read Finding Eliza, and one of the things I love about, I've used Finding Eliza so much in my academic work because it gives a way of critiquing the fictions about us so cleverly. But what I love is that in this book you model the thing that you have critiqued intellectually, and in particular you talk about in Finding Eliza about that typically the Aboriginal characters are not well-rounded characters. They're dark, shadowy figures. And in this book, all of the Aboriginal characters are well-rounded characters, are flawed, you know, make not the most ideal choices, but you get a sense for the beauty of all of the characters and a richer understanding of their life world. And an example of, and so to me, it models this kind of a Black humanity that understands things in a particular kind of way. And typically this kind of Black humanity that we have in being more understanding, it's framed as like that we're sort of, we don't have standards in our community, that we're, you know, and so I just wanted to read a part where you talk about, it shows Arnie Elaine and her understanding of this kind of Black humanity that was so familiar in reading in terms of our community. And because Della, Jasmine's mother, has a problem with drinking, and we get to understand why. But so Jasmine, in her voice, she asked Arnie Elaine once how you could tell if someone was an alcoholic. And Arnie Elaine said, "Goodness, Bob, what a question." And she said, "There were clinical answers to my question. If you stopped drinking and had withdrawal symptoms, or if you drank, did something destructive but kept drinking again." But Arnie Elaine responded, "Some people have so much pain they know no other way to ease it." It was the kind of answer she'd give that wouldn't seem like one until you really thought about it. And I just feel that throughout this story, you're forced to really think about these characters and the world that they occupy. From Jimmy, you know, Kiki, like all of the characters. And it models a Black humanity that we know in our own communities, that we often don't get to show to a broad audience. So I'm just rambling here, but
I love the observation. And you know, it's you're right about the thematics in Finding Eliza, but I didn't at all think about that when I was writing these stories. And I you know, obviously did a lot of research and I had a lot of things I wanted to say, but at the heart of it, I think because all of these characters are modeled on people I know and that I love,
Mm.
it's you know, you come from the place of loving their humanity, and it's actually was a theme in Legacy. And when I was really trying to come to terms with my relationship with the complex relationship with my father, who I adored but was very flawed, was that realization that when you really love somebody, you love them for every piece of what they are, you know. But I just want to dig into this idea about the humanity, because it's really interesting about that observation, because it really speaks to some of the things that really triggered me writing this book. And it was more about the experience of being an advocate for Aboriginal victims of crime, but also Aboriginal families who've had a death in custody. So kind of an amalgam of that world. And actually related to that, working in the area of child protection and seeing how decisions are still made about Aboriginal families and Aboriginal parenting that assume that there's no love for Aboriginal children, that stereotype's really rife and it's dangerous and it's toxic and it ruins people's lives, and it continues to contribute to that intergenerational trauma. But there was one very specific instance that sort of speaks to those perceptions of outsiders who don't see us as human, don't see that humanity. And I was with a parent of a child who was a victim of crime, and the legal process has not delivered justice in that family's case. And this parent was talking to a very senior member of the legal profession, and this person said to this father, you know, you should get some counselling and just move on. And I have never been able to not believe that that person was able to say that to this father, because that person was Aboriginal. He would never have said it to Daniel Morecambe's father. Like, never would he have ever said that, because he shouldn't have. And it's just where there's all these daily reminders, and in some ways, you know, that they're the things that, first of all, as First Nations people, when we tell stories, we want to celebrate that's actually, it's reinforcing that this is who we are, and this is, you know, how we are, good and bad, hard times, good times, laughter, tears, that's who we are. And in a way, I mean, you kind of do write this for your Indigenous audience, who you know you're speaking to and sharing that love and that insight with. And you are writing for your non-Indigenous audience to try and give them an insight into what they might not see or what they might want to understand differently. And it still strikes me, not just in this context, Chelsea, but, you know, in other work that we do around the spaces we work in. You know, I think of a film like In My Blood It Runs, which I was a producer on. You know, one of the most subversive things about that film is that, you know, it shows that Aboriginal people love their children. And when we were working with the families about what messaging they wanted, that was one of the first things they said. We just want people to know we love our kids. What kind of a society tells parents that that's something that you need to prove to people? So all of those kind of thematics were in my head, all of those kind of experiences about how people from outside look at our families that seem fractured and broken to them, and they don't see, you know, the warmth, the connection, the love, the intricacies, the resilience, all of those things. So that was a big driver for me in terms of you know, wanting to say something more about the worlds we're living in.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really clever with what you've done with this book, is that while you know the violence of settler fictions and have done that work, you've addressed that, but not in this kind of educative tone. Like, I felt this book was written for a Black audience, and that Black fellas would recognise Jasmine, Della, Arnie, Elaine, the friends at uni, you know, like all of the Black characters were recognisable to us. And I don't think people realise what it's like to see representations of yourself that don't reflect your lived reality. You know, I grew up with the, and I think you may remember with doing the the homework task about the Aborigines and going to the news agency and those trundle cards to get the Aborigines fold-out thing. And they were always Central Desert. There was always some basket weaving and cave painting. And that was who I was told was the Aborigine. And, you know, aside from the occasional person of colour on Hey Hey It's Saturday, we didn't get to see ourselves. I mean, I'm named after Chelsea Brown, who wasn't even Aboriginal, but was one of the few Black people on television at the time I was born. So I think people don't realise what it's like to be deprived of stories that speak to our own humanity and how that's important for us, independently of what white fellas think about us.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of did that. It's exactly, you know, in a way, that's what Jasmine's challenge has been, and obviously reflected my own childhood. You know, there weren't, you know, books by Anita Heiss or Tony Birch or Alexis Wright to read when I was growing up, and I would, you know, like to really acknowledge the really pioneering work that Anita's done in really breaking through in writing in genres that had not had Indigenous characters or Indigenous stories, and showing that there's a way in which those stories will feed us as First Nations people, but that there's an audience for them. So you didn't have that. But I would say this, you know, I did grow up reading that canon, and I did learn about feminism from Virginia Woolf, and I learned about class from George Orwell and Charles Dickens. My dad was always wanting to quiz me on what George Orwell means when he writes this. So it wasn't that there weren't ways in which those things helped understand certain structures that are part of the world that we all live in, because they're part of that colonial system. But the absence of those stories and those voices in that form. I mean, I think what's exciting now is not just that we have a body of literature and a body of writers that are adding to that canon of writing, but with the regeneration of languages, the reconnection with country, the fact that we now more often refer to ourselves by our nations than we do as Koori or Murray, the fact that when we do welcomes or acknowledgements of country, we know whose country we're on. These are all ways in which we're singing back our culture, that in engagements with weaving, possum cloak making, even storytelling, one of our oldest traditions, which we've done for a really long time through music, which was kind of Billy's storytelling in the Jimmy's storytelling in the book. Oops, just gave away that I changed his name at the last minute to protect identities. But anyway, amongst friends. So, you know, that song, the country music, storytelling through song is part of that tradition. But I feel like we're at a moment now where we've got so much more of that as part of our healing, but as part of our expression of sovereignty as a proactive, not just as a reactive thing. It's not just about healing, it's about our identity and who we are, and being strident about that and forceful, positive and strong. So I feel like there's more story around now, not just in those other forums. And so there's a much richer engagement. And I guess that was going back to Arnie Elaine. She always held that. She always knew those bits and pieces about what was around, though nobody bothered to ask. And she'd been through that era where people weren't encouraged, were punished for talking about it. But she held that in her heart and started to share it. So, you know, I feel like there's lots of ways in which we're now able to engage in those things, whether or not we're offered them by the way mainstream storytelling is done. We're kind of just, you know, doing that in our own way, on our own terms. I just add this, one of the things I've done in the last year was update my Indigenous Australia for Dummies book. And what I found to be one of the best things about doing that process was the chapters that I had to spend the most time updating were the ones around film and television and literature, because there's been so much in the last 10 years.
That's awesome. I found it interesting. So Jasmine's character is immersed in reading these texts as a child, but this kind of discovery of wishing she had heard more of the stories of Annie Elaine or listened to those, like, and her proximity to her during that time. As we've been yarning, we've been switching between Jazz and Jasmine. Can you explain to mob who haven't read the book about Jazzy and Jasmine?
Yeah, so Jasmine is so Jasmine's original spelling of her name is Jazzmine. So
It's very black.
very black, and she's called Jazzy for short. And it's almost a part of her trying to fit in and be, you know, acceptable to, you know, she's seeking a way of moving away from what she sees as the stigma of her family. And so she, in a way, anglicizes her name to Jasmine and insists on being called Jasmine. And sort of towards the end of the book, we slip a bit more back into Jazzy as she sort of finds herself. But in a way, it was really reflective of a very different identity struggle that we see a lot of people have. And I've set her up, I mean, in a way, I've said this is at the heart of it's a story about a mother and a daughter, but it's also a story about sisters, as you've said. There's Kiki, who's Della's sister, and they have their own relationship that's got its own dynamic that they've kind of found their groove on. But Leanne is with the death of Jasmine's eldest sister, her murder, Leanne moves from middle child to oldest living child, and is outspoken and forthright, and, you know, the kind of mouthy black woman, not at all known to you and I, Chelsea, you know, a mouthy black woman, a troublesome, always speaks their mind, stands up kind of person, and, you know, is easily labelled by people in a racist town as a troublemaker. And so a large part of Jasmine's insecurity is to try and fit in, to be a good one, to be one of the good ones. So she's colonized in a really different way, a way that we have seen. I think I was very lucky that wasn't my experience. I had parents who, from the start, made me very proud of who I was, and I've never felt like I've ever had to apologise. But I particularly in the academy see a lot of our younger students come through who have been through that process and have excelled and been the good ones. And there's a process of decolonizing that goes on about shifting that sense. So in a way, the whole thing about her name and who she is and how she calls herself is just another manifestation of her really struggling with just a newer form of toxic colonization that makes people ashamed of who they are, but in a different way than the way that, you know, Arnie Elaine would have not been able to speak her language.
I want to talk about the writing of the book and how the process of it. But before I do, I just want to talk about the structural element of the text and the switching between Della and Jasmine. And can we talk, let's go if I ask you about this one. So this is like, there is an order to things in terms of we hear from mum's account first. And I really enjoyed reading because reading mum's account, and then you'd get how Jasmine had interpreted the same part of the tour. But then, and I don't know exactly where you do it, but then you switch the order of things and we have Jasmine's account come before Della's.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell us, without spoiling anything, tell us about why you did that? What was that about?
And it was a deliberate choice, and it felt like the right time to switch them. And it was, in a way, a little bit of a sense of, you know, here's Della, she's going on the tour, she doesn't know the writers or the writers, as though we're sort of slightly privileging in a way that that Western knowledges tell us to, that Jasmine knows more about this because she's read it, like she knows the stuff. And I feel that there's a point in the story where we start to realize that actually Della is the one who has the knowledges that we're most engaged with, and we start to see that she's the real knowledge holder. And there's a part of her own story where for the first time she's asked a question about her own culture, and she can speak in the way she actually draws immediately on exactly what Arnie Elaine would say, and it's almost where she starts to find her voice as a knowledge holder. And so almost from that, and that's also a trigger to her confronting something of her past. So it's almost the culmination of that, and when that moment happens, that we we change the privilege, because she's now become the more confident. She starts to tell the stories, and she's more confident as that knowledge holder and storyteller. And then, of course, I think the same. I mean, obviously Jasmine's so much more like who I am than Della, but I found Della so much easier to write because I could hear the voices of the women she was based on so clearly. And I really loved her, whereas I struggled with Jasmine for a while, which is probably, work I've still got to do on myself. But I had a harder time with Jasmine. I was probably tougher on her, but I really loved Della. And so it also felt to me like I wanted to hear her more. So I held her back. And I did feel like, I feel like it's an important protocol we have to let our strong women have the last word. And I thought it was really important that she have the last word in the book, because that's how she would have been culturally, that Jasmine had to stop assuming that she knew more.
Oh, I love having the last word. So I particularly, I love it. Because what I love about, even in Della's supposed unknowing, she's not dumb, and I just, the questions she has about things that are unfamiliar to her are more insightful, and lend themselves to a deeper understanding of things than any of the other experts who know all about the context of the places that they're at. And so I just love how you honor the dignity of the characters, even in a supposed unknowing. And it speaks to so much of the power of even Black intellectual curiosity in the academy. And we kind of are trying to look at the build off the call from Professor Lester Rigney about Indigenous intellectual sovereignty, of not producing the knowledges that these institutions insist we produce about ourselves that somehow explain what's wrong with us, and instead assert our own knowledges, instead ask our own questions that have purpose to us. And so I love that's reflected in this fictional text, and honors the curiosities of Black fellas, that we're not unknowing, even if we're unfamiliar with something. And that's just the way in which you would tend to the dignity of all Black characters in this, regardless of what's going on in their world. I just think it is unfamiliar in a lot of texts, and so it was nourishing to read and to feel and to go, yeah. And I wanted to be at that table and like rouse people, like, because we've been there, we've been that Black fellow who's asked a question and people think we're stupid,
Yeah. I feel that was an important thing for me to explore. And in a way, there was a bit of a dig at Della as to why she'd even go on something like this, because she doesn't read, and the only things she knows about the stories is if she's seen a television adaptation of them. But actually, I loved the idea that we would actually slowly unfold the fact that this is when you talk about what we bring to the academy, this is the concept of deep listening that we talk about. If you listen to what she says and reflect on it, not take it on your own terms, take it on her terms. So you have to do the work. You have to work out what she's saying. You have to listen. Then she is the wisest person on that trip, even more than the tour guide and the literature professor. She has this kind of knowledge that creeps up on you. And even when she says something and she's, there's a couple of instances early on in the story where she's just shut down, people dismiss, and Jasmine's response isn't to defend her, it's to feel embarrassed, so shame on Jasmine. So
she made me wild, Jasmine, sometimes.
I just wanted to give her a bit of a, and that's the world she's kind of been colonized into. You don't embarrass yourself. It's a revelation to Jasmine that other people actually start to see in Della what she hasn't seen. So that sort of always felt like it was really important. But I just think from a Black fella point of view, it's that kind of like, she gives you that voice. It's not a slap down. It's just the reality check. I kind of was that thing. I love this story. When I first got accepted into Harvard, first Aboriginal person to go to Harvard Law School, so big deal, and lots of fanfare and lots of, great stuff about people, congratulations. And I just loved, like, the aunties in Redfern would just go, that's great, bub, but what are you going to do when you get back? And they weren't saying, like, they were proud. They weren't saying there was nothing to be proud about, but I just loved the way in which it was a loving kind of thing about, you know, just put it in perspective. This isn't the end, this is the beginning, and you're doing this, but what are you going to do next? And it's just that simplicity of really understanding what they were saying. And it was the most loving thing anyone said, which was, this isn't the achievement, bub. This is the beginning. And how right were they? And I just wanted to really, in that spirit of those kind of women who just will say that one thing at the end of the meeting after everyone's been carrying on like pork chops, and it's like, yeah, that. And that's kind of who I wanted our little Della to be. And, you know, and she finds her voice through that process.
We love Della. I want to know about how you wrote this book. I want to know how you find the time to write a book, like, and how long it took. But did you actually do the tour that the book's around?
I did go to all the places, and I did them just about in order. There was a bit of finagling just in terms of the story thing, and I dropped a couple of little places that I had in addition. There was no formal tour to be done, so I made it up, and I dragged my then boyfriend around on it, who proposed at the end of the trip, so that was good. If you can take someone to the Brontë parsonage and the Jane Austen village and and then to Jane Austen's bath, and they still want to marry you, then I say, you know, it's probably going to be okay.
Is it keeper?
Yeah, he's a keeper. So we did do that. So I derived that bit from doing that myself. But I had been on those kind of trips. I never did a literary tour with my mother, but in my early 20s, when we first kind of had the means to do a little bit of travel, because it was something we would never have imagined doing when I was growing up. We did a couple of those on the bus, off the bus tours, and it just struck me. I mean, we lived in an overcrowded house with lots of people, so it wasn't like there was ever any privacy or space when I was growing up, and you know, silence still seems really unnatural to me. But so it wasn't like I wasn't in proximity to her, but I thought, even with all of that, there was never a time when I was so unable to get away from her if then in those contexts. So as a literary device, as a narrative device, I was quite interested in that, plus the idea of taking them, as we mentioned earlier, to a place that was outside of their comfort zone. So it was almost an instinct that, in a way of, I mean, and this is not an unusual story, although it's not the usual pathway, that our going away from home is the thing that makes us realize it's where we belong, or it helps us understand what it is that it gives us. So they were doing that process in their own way through doing that trip. So those elements came together. And then, as I said earlier when we were talking, there were these things that were happening in my professional life about the cases I'd been working on, particularly the attitudes I see in child protection, where you know, I feel like there's just such appalling entrenched racism around how the people understand our stories, and I just felt the need to be doing that. And to be honest, Chelsea, I think the other thing is that you know, we are all in particular, I think if we do hard work, whether that's in the academy, in the legal system, in the health system, and sometimes those things overlapping, these cases are hard, and you are working with members of your own community who are so much worse off than you are. You have a privilege compared to them, but it doesn't mean it doesn't take its own toll on you in terms of what you see, what you hear, the attitudes that are expressed. And, you know, I know you know all of this, but for people who are listening who don't know that, you know, you carry all of that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that almost everybody I know, Black fellas who work in that kind of space, do some kind of cultural practice as a way of also keeping strong. And we do it it's where we get our resilience. And again, I don't just do this as it's a healing. It is, of course it is, it's cathartic and all of those things, but it's a positive action of strength and defiance to engage in cultural practice as well. Like, it's a strengths-based activity. And, you know, whether it's possum cloak making or it's storytelling, you know, I think, you know, look at somebody like, well, both Amy Maguire and Alison Whittaker, you know, really fantastic in terms of the work they do in their professional spheres as journalists and lawyers, but also writing amazing books as well. I just think it's a kind of way in which we do that. So I sort of feel like the writing it doesn't not let me do it. I kind of feel like I need it. And it's that thing too, you know, sometimes it's easy to process something. You can write an article about a case or something that's really unjust. You can write a UN complaint, as I'm doing with a couple of colleagues from National Justice Project, which we're both involved with at the moment. You know, you can do those kind of actions that are writing, but there is something else where you can't find the words, or the words are too painful, or you don't know how to say it yet. And I've found, for me, fiction's a way of being able to process the things that I've perhaps found too hard or too difficult, or I don't know the words to articulate, and they find themselves in the thematics of the story.
I mean, yeah, I think you know, so much of our being is bound up in resistance, and you know, I'm not afraid of a fight. Those who know me. But I also enjoy just being some days. And one of the things I loved about, like, even doing Wild Black Woman, is that we could just turn up and talk and laugh and just be. There wasn't a function for anyone else. It wasn't. And so, I mean, that's what to be fully human is, just to be, to not have to always fight, to always, you know, be engaged in battle, or and be consumed by injustice, even though it's part of the air that we breathe every day, all the time. And yeah, I'm just fascinated by, and when I coming through, when I first doing my PhD and having babies and not knowing what an academic was, and what an academic could do. I mean, my father roused me about going to university because, you know, this wasn't things that people like us did. But seeing your career, that you could do really important intellectual work, you could do important policy work, you could make documentaries, and you could write books, and you could be Black and be all kinds of things, and you didn't have to just do this particular kind of work. And I think yeah, it's been such it's been exciting to be able to watch the possibilities of what a Black academic can do, and you've just shown the breadth of that. But there's a cohesiveness to all of the stuff that you do, like it's all connected.
Yeah, I always feel that too. Like, if in a way, I didn't set out to be an academic, and I didn't set out to be a professor, and you know, I did set out to be a lawyer because I thought I'd change the world, but I learned pretty quickly that being a legal aid lawyer at Parramatta Family Court was not going to do what I wanted it to do. Right. But you're absolutely right. Like, for me, the only career ambition I've had is to be proactive as an agent for social justice change for my people. And that, whether it's, you know, doing speaking out, or it's writing the book, or doing Collingwood Report, whatever it is, it's always just a manifestation of that. And I often find, like, people say, oh, how do you, I mean, it feels to me like there's a cohesiveness there as well. Maybe that's just my crazy mind, but it does feel like there is a one driving thing. And I guess it's a parallel thing. It is wanting to deconstruct these hideous stereotypes and these systems that don't work. But, you know, I had the gift of growing up in a family that was really proud of being Aboriginal. And, you know, by the time I got to uni and was surrounded by, you know, Robin and Anita and Terry Janke, you know, there were other women of my generation that felt the same way. So it's always been a part of being able to express a real pride in a community that I don't understand why other people can't see what I see in it. I know our mob do, but it strikes me as really surprising. I always think, in a way, it's the story comes to you, and then you find, you know, you'll think, well, is this something that's better told as a fiction? Is this something that's better told as a documentary? Like, if this is the story, what's the most powerful thing? But I would say, if there's one thing I guess I've appreciated learning, and I've learned this from a lot of the families I've worked with in my legal work, I credit them with teaching this to me, is that I guess one thing that I've learned in terms of being a storyteller, although we're talking about something that I've authored at the moment, one of the things that's really drawn me to broadcasting and film I think there's lots of times when we tell the story because we've got a language, like as a lawyer, you know how to translate the situation of your client into the language of the court and how to play the system and, you know, how to challenge that system. So you're an advocate for them, much like, you know, when you write a novel, you're putting your own authorial voice on something. The thing that I've found really joyous in the last this last evolution of my working life is the real privilege of working as an advocate, where your role is to find space to give other people their voice, which is why I love broadcasting, speaking out, but why I love documentary filmmaking, where, you know, being able to move from being the advocate in court to the person behind the camera, creating a space so somebody has the ability to be able to tell their story in their own voice, both because of the power it has on the listener to hear that voice from such authenticity, from such realness, from such pain, from a voice that they have never had the privilege of hearing before, but also seeing how, from being marginalized and silenced in a system, somebody being able to tell their story can be the reignition of them as an agent of change themselves. So those things, I think, have been certainly something there's been an evolution in terms of thinking about my own practice as a academic / lawyer / whatever. But you know, it does, I guess, show that you can still keep learning and find that there are new ways to do the thing you love.
And for blackfellas, there is an ethics of practice around privileging Indigenous voices, and it's something that we all have to do around passing the mic and not being the one, and not being the Indigenous voice. And I think oftentimes we may be called upon to be that voice at various tables and various settings and various institutions. And I think people don't realise that for a lot of blackfellas, there is a whole ethics of practice around finding ways to amplify the voices of mob. And what are the best mediums to make sure that voice gets heard, is honoured, is valued, and not erased or trivialised or, you know, contested. Now I could talk for ages with you, but I know we have some time for the people here to join us in conversation and ask some questions of you. So I think we can open up the chat. I think people can put questions in the chat.
Yeah, people have been writing in. Everyone's a little shy tonight, so this is your last opportunity, everyone.
I see people pouring wine. Have a drink.
We kind of what you were touching on just before. This is a question from Carly for Larissa, but I think Chelsea, you can also speak to this. Carly says, I would love to know how Larissa deals with being in the academic space, how she manages to respectfully celebrate our stories and knowledges when many are based on early colonial and often racist sources.
Oh, what a great question. Well, I would just say this. I don't think I would have survived in the academy if I didn't have the space at Jumbana, which we've worked really hard to create. It's no coincidence that I've been able to have an academic career and I have not been in a faculty for 20 years. I'll just say that the space we've got is independent of that, and we report directly to the provost. So we are, you know, we don't have anyone else who gatekeeps what we do. And that's been a very big part of it. I think it's a really, you know, it is a really hard space for blackfellas. And I think the only way I've been able to stay in that space was to ensure that I had a peer group and a cohort and a, you know, really strong collegial group that's been a part of that. And you know, I think it's exhausting otherwise. And I'm not sure, I mean, it's probably also a bit triggering for both Chelsea and myself to be talking about such a topic, but, you know, I had such terrible experiences before I went to Jumbana, particularly at UNSW when I was a staff member, which just outed them. But anyway, I loved being there as a student, but it was just one of those places where I started to get a glimpse of the sorts of microaggressions and quite overt racism that I would face if I stayed on that path. And, you know, it made me think for a long time about whether I could have an academic career. So I think I was lucky that I found what I wanted. And the thing that's always, apart from being, making that space, having that peer group, knowing that the space itself isn't going to be nurturing, so finding ways to create that community or bring your community with you so that you've got that there. I think particularly, being at UTS, we're right next to Redfern, so it's nothing to kind of hop over there and feel like you're at home again. But, I think that there's that, but I think part of it is there's a way in which we can go into institutions and they colonize us, or we go into institutions and we try and shape them so that so that we use them in a way that is strategic. There is an enormous way in which I've seen Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people be subversive in terms of getting institutions to do their work for them. And if you want to use an international example, look at how the only international human rights declaration that was authored by the people that it affects is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There was some subversiveness that went on that meant that Indigenous people, not states, did that one thing. So you see all these examples of that happening. And I think that's just, you kind of have to know that's the game. If I couldn't be at a place that has allowed me to work with the Barraville families, work with the families of deaths in custodies that we're working on, do those coronial processes, to be able to, this was a big test for me, to see the intervention coming and to say, we are going to stand up. We were the only Indigenous organisation at a university that stood up against the intervention as vocally as we did. It was absolutely the right thing to do. I would never have done it differently. We paid a high price for that, but so be it. But it meant when we did that, the university backed us 100%. So there was something about that place that meant I knew that we wouldn't have to be compromised by the things that we wanted to say, that we had to say, that we had the privilege to say. And that's been a big part of it. So I think it's just a way of saying, I think that I've been lucky in that I worked out early about the need to have that space, and then I was able to find it before those institutions swallowed me up and spat me out, and partly because of the attitudes of some of the people at UTS who decided that if that's what the First Nations leadership at the university said we should do, then we should do it. And that is a very, very rare thing. I'd challenge anyone else to find another institution that's done that. Do you want to name one?
I'm sorry.
So yeah, I should just, because I think it'd be great to hear from you on that as well.
My undergrad was doing a small Indigenous cohort course back when we used to have those kinds of things, and I would just turn 17 in my first year of uni. And I sat at the table with established community workers and people who've lived full lives. So I didn't have the training that Jasmine had, being disciplined by my discipline. I got to watch mature age Black students give it to the lecturers, contest the text that we were forced to read. And so I had a really great training ground for my 3 years undergrad degree program, where 5 days a week from 9 till 5, we sat in a classroom and contested the texts that were told about us. And hence, I think why I get to do the work that I do, because of that training. And it's in the power of the Black collective that Black intellectual collective, that we get the sense of community, but we also get the courage to stand up, and also to remember the truth about who we are and the lies that colonial institutions tell about us and about themselves. What I've learned is to never believe the story that the colonizers tell about themselves, not just the story they tell about us. And I think a lot of younger people get most traumatized is when they discover the truth about these institutions that they believed cared about them. And in this indigenizing moment in higher ed, so much of it is lies. It's absolute lies. And we just need our kids to know that. So if you know the truth of these places, then you could navigate them a whole lot. You don't have to then travel overseas with your mother to be reminded of the value of who you are and where you come from, because you'll enter a campus every day knowing that and staying true to that. So yeah, for me, it's always how I've survived in all of the nonsense I've had to deal with, which is nowhere near, Larissa, what you had to deal with, and the price that you've had to pay in the midst of these fights, is the power of our community, which we know. I mean, that's why I live where I live. It's mob that hold us, keep us strong.
Yeah.
Not our degrees, and not the titles that colonial institutions bestow to us.
I'm going to just add two quick things to that, because you've just made me think of two things. One, I should say, when they come for you, they come for you. But if they don't, then you're probably not doing your job.
Exactly.
But the upside of that is, I know I walk into communities all around the country, and I feel the respect people have for me because I've used my voice that way. So it's not like there is a great privilege I feel from that, and my mobs felt me, kept me very strong. And some of the people who are on this Zoom tonight have been part of that group as well. And I just want to say, because I couldn't go through tonight without saying it, one of the best things I've read this year, apart from Anita's book, is I have had the privilege to read the copy of Chelsea's book that's coming out at the end of the year, officially out. And I have to say, I still find it hard to put into words how powerful it is. And I think that book in and of itself, which I just recommend everyone, you can go and pre-order it now while you're pre-ordering After Story or getting a copy of After Story. But Chelsea's book, I think, gives a language to explain what that feels like. And I actually had this conversation with Chelsea before, that I got a third of the way through the book and I had the most cathartic cry, because I'd never even myself been able to articulate what it feels like to fight in those institutions the way that she's just, in a kind of Della type way, just laid it out as it is. And I feel like that's a real gift too, that we are actually now finding voices and stories that actually help us explain what we're feeling and explain the dynamics we're working amongst. And the book's so much more than that, but I couldn't not go through Chelsea and not say how amazing that book is.
Thank you. Thank you. But yeah, it's like finding Eliza, because one chapter is using finding Eliza to understand a particular really violent story that was told published in the same year that Finding Eliza was. Jackie Huggins' Sister Girl, reading that many years ago and going, here's a Black woman just writing from place, and just in a way that made sense. Anyone can read that book, and I still return to it. It still does things, which is getting republished, we're going to reprint next year as well with UQP. So it's just there's this tradition of Black women's writing that we've been beneficiaries of, and this staunch, and I think Romaine Morton talks about the sovereign storyteller, whether it's in the published text or in the creative mediums. How fortunate we are to have the Arnie Elaines in our world to remind us how to turn up and tell our stories in our way. And I mean, that's the beauty of this book, it has an authenticity, and not in the cringy traditional authentic Aboriginal story, but in just we feel the spirit of these characters and the story. And I finished the book, ugly face crying. It wrecked me at the end, and so I can't talk about what the end does. And then I got wild because I wanted more. And I said to you before, I'm like, I was wild at the ending because I wanted more. But that's the sign of a good story, is it leaves you wanting to know more because you're so deeply invested in the story of the people that you've introduced us to. And so I want to thank you for the gift of After Story
thank
that
you.
you've given us.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the lovely conversation and for all the work you do.
Thank you.
We might have time for just one more question before we wrap up. Sandy asks, I know you talked about readership, and Chelsea, clearly the story really resonated with you. But who is the one person or group of people you hope read After Story?
Oh, what a great question, Sandy. I guess for me, I do, there's nothing like somebody writing to you and saying, I saw myself in those, or I saw my mum, or I saw my grandma. So, you know, Chelsea's right. There is a tradition of us exchanging stories as Aboriginal women that still is a part of our modern cultural practice. And I was just actually thinking, as Chelsea was speaking there, about some of the books she's engaging with, that I'm working on some new non-fiction work, and this part of the canon I'm going back to is actually, you know, stories by Anita and Alexis, and you know, I see that as part of my legal canon, which is interesting. So, you know, I feel like that's, you know, it's touching when anyone feels something. You know, you love the book Can Find a Home with Anyone, but when somebody close to you, or somebody who's of your world, loves it. I think the two things that have been lovely for me was somebody, I can't remember who it was now, but one of our fierce Aboriginal warrior women had said that it showed that I really loved Aboriginal women the way that I do, and I'm glad that came across. And my mum said, "You did a very nice job, Riss," and that was very high praise. And I should just say, as a final thing to share with you all, it took me many years to write this book, and Madonna Duffy, who's my editor at UQP, I was always saying to her, you know, this is the least autobiographical thing I've written, because it's all about the cases I work on and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it's about all this intergenerational trauma and the treatment of our women. And I don't know, maybe about 18 months before I finished the book, I was doing my usual spiel to her, which was also explaining why I hadn't finished the thing yet. And I just had this epiphany moment where I was like, oh my God, Madonna, this is totally about me and my mother. It's all about me and my mum. And just, you know, I won't go into it more than that, but just to say, it was, you know, until I was an adult, I didn't realize what trauma she had. And I assumed her dealing with her trauma was her dealing with me, and it wasn't the same thing. So ergo, ta-da, and then I was able to finish the book. So yeah, so probably mum saying I did a good job in the way that is high praise from her. If you know my mum, that meant a lot to me too.
And so we're talking earlier that about the two characters, but for me, the two characters kind of reflected the kind of double consciousness that blackfellas embody every day in this place. You know, Jasmine and Della could be one body, and the warring ideals that blackfellas have in our own mind when we navigate this place. And I don't subscribe to the idea that we walk in two worlds, but I'm, you know, interested in Du Bois' sense of double consciousness. And so at another level, I think the two characters are actually an insight into the consciousness of blackfellas in this place.
Oh, I love that.
And those warring ideals at times. And what I love what you do is you restore a sense of wholeness and attend to the dispossessing nature of this place. Ironically, over there, it's over there that there's a sense of restoring whole and a sense of belonging and an articulation of sovereignty. I think Jasmine finds the language to even speak of that. So I just think this book works in so many different levels in thinking about how we navigate this, and it's just really clever and beautiful, and yeah, I love it.
Thank you. Oh, and Sandy, I'm pretty happy that Chelsea likes it too. That means a lot to me as well.
I don't like everything. Not sure if you realised.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time tonight. This has been such an incredible book chat. Thank you both, Chelsea and Larissa, for taking the time on a Friday night, and Larissa for being flexible. We're sorry we couldn't do this in person, but we appreciate you joining us on Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you, avid reader. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. We've had heaps of thank yous pour into the chat. One of them is from Diane. She's actually 80 years old. And she just wanted to say, thank you so much. You've opened a new world for me. And I can't wait not only to read your book, but learn more and understand better. So, thank you, everyone. This has been such a good chat. Remember to buy After Story at Avid Reader with the link that I sent through, or especially if you're in New South Wales, please support your local bookseller and order there.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.